This is Rate of Rise, brought to you by Roast Magazine. Today we're talking about cupping with Charlie Habegger of Royal Coffee. Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DeFirio with Keys to the Shop, and welcome to another episode in the Rate of Rise series where we have elevated conversations on roasting. This is brought to you by Roast Magazine, which is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry. Roast Magazine presents articles in every aspect of roasting that you could possibly think of. If you want to keep up to date with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals from across the global coffee roasting industry, then you definitely need to be subscribed. They've also published many amazing books on green coffee, on roasting, on the supply chain. You need to check them out at roastmagazine.com, and also check out the audio articles at roastmagazine.com/audio articles. If you want to be equipped for success as a roaster, go subscribe to Roast Magazine. Check them out at roastmagazine.com. Okay, everybody. Well, today we're going to be talking about cupping, and in particular, how we can actually relax around the cupping process because of some of the discoveries around the variables related to extraction yield in the cupping process, and where we can go from there as professionals looking to make the right decisions about the coffees in front of us on the cupping table. The article in Roast Magazine that discusses this is titled, "Why We Can Stop Worrying About Extraction Yield in Cupping," and it was written by today's guest, Charlie Habegger. Now, Charlie is a coffee buyer with field experience in over 20 producing countries. He has built sourcing and quality systems with Intelligentsia, Handsome Coffee Roasters, Blue Bottle, and he has been a U.S. Barista Championship finalist and the subject of a documentary film called Barista. Charlie has volunteered with the Coffee Quality Institute, leading local Curator teams in Myanmar and the Philippines. And Charlie is now proudly with Royal Coffee in the Bay Area, where he has the fun title of Sourcing, Curator, and Placement Specialist, which is a project-based position of sourcing and marketing. So in today's conversation with Charlie, we're going to be discussing how his perspective on cupping and quality evaluation of coffees has evolved over his career. We'll also talk about this article, about why we don't have to worry about extraction yield in cupping, and where we go from there and how we adjust the way that we taste coffees and introduce maybe other methods to help us evaluate the full spectrum of what the coffee has to offer in terms of flavor potential. And all of this, as we discuss here today, impacts the way that we present coffees to the consumer. It impacts the way that we talk about coffee with producers in terms of how we evaluate the quality of those coffees, and ultimately helps us make more solid decisions for better relationships across the supply chain. I'm really excited to have gotten this opportunity to talk to Charlie today. It's a legend in the industry, and I know you're going to get a ton from this. So without anything else from me, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation with Charlie Habegger. Well, hey, Charlie, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Despite the fact that we're going to be talking about cupping today, I am at home in my pantry with the curtains pulled. So I have very few visual cues in front of me from any sort of coffee lab. This will be entirely from memory and passion, where I wish I was instead of where I am.
That's awesome. So a little sensory deprivation while we're talking about sensory stuff.
I'm totally deprived. I'm very sensitive at the moment.
Love it. Love it. Well, I'm excited to talk to you today about the subject of cupping. You've written this great article for Roast Magazine about why we can stop worrying about extraction percentages in cupping, why we can kind of relax around that. And so this is going to be a great discussion. But I feel like a great place to start this discussion would be to talk about how in your career you've done so much in sensory analysis and cupping for major companies, and you have developed a certain perspective on the industry. And I'm curious to learn, what is it that has really stood out to you in career, a few key moments that have kind of shaped the way that you have maybe learned and unlearned about cupping standards and expectations?
That is a really good question. When I first started working in coffee, it was as a barista, and I wasn't working for a coffee roaster. I was working while I was finishing a graduate school degree for an independent cafe that was a wholesale account of Intelligentsia coffee in Chicago. So what I kind of knew, when I first started working with coffee was that there was this sort of big institution in town that controlled a lot of the quality standards, and we were supposed to feel very lucky for being in their good graces. This was back in like the 2007, 2008, when there were very few specialty coffee roasters that were trading wholesale accounts actively. It was kind of hard to get into that institutional knowledge. And at the time, I'd been at grad school, I was doing a research degree in the social sciences. I thought I wanted to stay in academia. There was something about Intelligentsia specifically, because I was living in Chicago at the time, that appealed to me for being academic. It was sort of like, we started this company in 1995, and there are not a lot of standards in specialty coffee. We're really interested in exploring standards that we can use to guide our own decision making. That is like it's moralistic, it's also functional and effective, it's egalitarian, things like that. And so Intelligentsia was this company that really tried to lay down a framework for itself to follow in terms of both sourcing, but also quality analysis, barista training, the whole stack, as it were, for coffee. And when I started as a wholesale account, just outside of this, I was sort of aware that there was this big institution in the city where I lived that had a lot of this knowledge and was also working hard to generate it, which was the part that appealed to me as an academic. So after I left this cafe, I applied for a job as a barista with Intelligentsia, and that's where I ended up working for the next 5 years. Cupping at Intelligentsia Coffee during those years was very sensitive. It was very sort of nerve center of the business, and it was very exclusive. It was very difficult to be taught how to cup. You had to really ingratiate yourself. It took a lot of time. Looking back on it, it feels like a very old school kind of apprenticeship. I spent a lot of my non-shift hours showing up at the roastery and kind of ingratiating myself to the roasters and to the people in the QC lab upstairs, until, eventually people started to take me seriously, and I started joining for more and more and started picking up, again, very institutionally, like learning from the place where I was employed about how they did it and why they thought it was important. So there was a gravity to cupping, and I think there still is a gravity to cupping. And you can tell when you're in the presence of people who do take it really seriously but don't have a lot of experience with it, that it can be very intimidating. And many people are, excited to do it, but they're also nervous about getting it right. Um, and over the years, as I always had my eye on the supply chain. I always wanted to work in the specialty coffee supply chain. I always wanted to work as a coffee buyer, really from the moment I understood what that position looked like in specialty coffee. Um, you know, the the arguments being made from specialty buyers who were traveling and bringing coffees back to consuming markets, about why these coffees were important, about why we should know more about where they come from, why consumer decisions matter, and watching consumers respond to that argumentation in positive ways, and then reinforce, further buying of the same coffees from the same relationships or new coffees from evolving markets in the producing world. That to me was like the ultimate inspiration. I was like, I want to be a part of this argument. And I use argument in a very positive way. Um, and cupping was it was like the translation point between the producing world and the consuming world. And learning cupping when I did at Intelligentsia Coffee during these years, it was a very like high impact time for me, and also for specialty coffee in the United States, because, very few people had like a single origin coffee from Papua New Guinea before, roasted the way that Intelligentsia did. Pete's Coffee was doing some of that stuff, not necessarily promoting the producers, but Pete's has had single origin coffees for a really long time, doing it their own way. And the Cup of Excellence was really coming, maturing a lot, and there were a lot of new producers around the world who were sort of putting their work on the table. and buyers were bringing these coffees in, and it was all based on cupping. Cup of excellence, all cupping, right? Every roasting decision we made was all cupping. There was a point after I had been working as a barista for about a year, year and a half at Intelligentsia, and at that point was promoted to the role of educator, which was a very unique job for Intelligentsia at that time. It was kind of like the chef of the store, the person who makes all the decisions about what's on the menu, how it gets extracted. We can yes, no, brew methods. We train all the employees, everything. We can get into that later too. But there was a point where we were cupping every single coffee for the menu that day in the hour before the cafe opened, just to calibrate our expectations as we were designing how coffee was going to be brewed. So it was like every single day we started from scratch. So, I guess to zoom out a little bit, cupping was how we decided what was valuable. And it was like throughout the supply chain, especially on the consumer side. And if you didn't have that skill set, you couldn't participate in those decisions. So, for me, I had this enormous reverence for cupping at the very beginning because it was my way in. If I could be a competent taster and if I could participate in this decision-making process, then it felt like I could be a part of that argument. And that's really what I wanted. I wanted to be further upstream, and that's, cupping was how you got there.
Wow. Yeah. Kind of coming from the same era of coffee back then, I remember there being so many, new ways of approaching coffee so as to safeguard kind of the specialness of the coffees being brought in. And as you're describing the seriousness and gravity of cupping, it just reminds me of when Michael Phillips was on the show talking about the Intelligentsia training model that was created back in the day that was really, so complex and was basically just impossible. And so I'm curious about the cupping and the way the industry has approached it as we've proliferated our tools and kind of elevated our expectations. Is there a sense in which we've kind of added things to the process that are superfluous? They don't necessarily matter as much as we kind of wanted them to or thought they did in order to just make sure that we are covering all the bases, but it was actually just kind of ineffective.
A little bit. I mean, the question makes me think of standardization in general, and not to get too like zoomed out on everything, but one thing I've noticed is, as specialty coffee roasting expands, and there are more roasters roasting great coffees who are curating their own lineups, designing brewing systems and coffee service systems, there is what used to be a lot more centralized decision making that was difficult to access. It's now much more accessible. And I think in response to that, organizations like the SCA, equipment manufacturers like VST Technology, they put brew guides and they put pieces of technology in the hands of people running these shops, and it becomes, instead of like an apprentice model, like the training system that Michael Phillips described was one that I was very much an instigator of, and I very much condoned that training system at the time, and it was my job to carry it out at the shop. And I can attest to the fact that there's such a thing as too much apprenticeship, and there's such a thing as like too much gatekeeping, and it does sort of increase people's hunger for it. But I think it also only works when you have a small industry, right? Because then people, they really don't have a choice. It's like I'm hiring baristas at the Broadway Intelligentsia, and people are sending us resumes from Florida, and the cover letter literally says, "I will move to Chicago if you will hire me as a barista for $9 an hour because with you I can learn coffee." You don't quite see that anymore because this knowledge that people couldn't find, 15 years ago, it's so much more accessible. I do think with that accessibility comes, it's like knowledge before experience in some cases, where people can confidently, roast a coffee using curves on Cropster. They can feel pretty confident that they've got the basics dialed in. They can dial in the coffee on bar using a refractometer, and just sort of, they can know that they're doing things adequately along the way, and you can get from zero to like a very serviceable specialty coffee retail model so much faster than you ever could. And that's wonderful. I do think with that, you tend to have maybe a little bit less creativity because people have a standard reference that they can use to sort of know if they're doing it correct or not. And I think a lot of the language that gets passed around is language of, correct versus incorrect. Your extraction is correct, your extraction is too much or too little, or your coffee is too strong or too weak, and here's a box. You want to be in it, and if you're not in it, you should probably worry that what you're serving is incorrect. I think that can be a little bit overwrought, the same way that, you know, forcing people to jump through too many hoops just to be able to dial in coffee in the morning or to be able to join the roasters at the cupping table can also um, overdo it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So then the question becomes, what do you replace correct with?
Right. That's a very, very good question. Um, in my experience, cupping coffee over the last 15 years, and this is the thing that I really enjoyed about writing the article, was that cupping was seen as sort of the ultimate way to explore a coffee. And the assumption was that if you hadn't cupped a particular coffee, you didn't understand the full potential of that particular coffee. And you wouldn't know if you're roasting or if you're brewing, for retail, if that was in any way, accurate or faithful to the original coffee. So cupping was sort of understood to be this like broad arc of development where you could see the whole story start to finish, and then you would pick and choose what you wanted to extract and what you wanted to serve to your customers. I think that that is actually quite backwards. What I find after so many years of cupping personally and in many different labs and having cuppings presented to me, as I'm working in the field all over the world, or, even just like lab to lab, roaster to roaster here in the Bay Area, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, cupping is actually, I find, to be quite a forgiving way to look at a particular coffee. And the brewing of the coffee itself, whether it's espresso or filter or, cloth drip or mocha pot or however you want to do it, actually brings a lot more um, variability and a lot more diversity to a single coffee than cupping could ever show you. And the reason I really liked doing this article was like I found some research that helped me explain this and helped me prove what I sort of felt in my gut to be true, after cupping and cupping and cupping for so many years and feeling like, oh, the same coffees are always tasting the same, and it's because we're cupping them. They could taste wildly different if we decided to, extract them differently using different methods. And here we are at the cupping table, kind of limiting ourselves to this one presentation. But what we're telling ourselves about it is that it's giving us everything we need to know. So I started to feel like that was, backwards. And that's really why I wanted to write the article. I do, however, want to answer your first question about specific cupping moments and how they might have changed my standards or expectations. So a couple that come to mind, and it's funny how, as you think about this, all the day-to-day cuppings that I did, 5 years at Intelligentsia, 5 years at Blue Bottle, 1 year at Handsome, and now 3 years at Royal Coffee. It's like cupping pretty much every single day at all of these companies. And it's like all of the cuppings we've ever done in the same lab pretty much all blend together, and I can't remember a single one anymore. But the ones that do stand out to me are the ones where I am out of my own element and I'm attempting to establish some sort of understanding with other coffee graders who are professional tasters, but who are not part of my team. And we are attempting to calibrate with one another. And the biggest one overall that comes to mind was when I was a volunteer in the Philippines, and I think this was 2018, and I was invited to speak at the Philippines Specialty Coffee Conference that year, and there was also a big cupping competition that kind of marked the end of a development project that was being done in one of the southern islands of the Philippines. And there were two sections of coffee because the Philippines is a coffee producing country with a huge range of processing styles and varieties in play. And so there, of course, there was an Arabica side of the cupping competition, and then there was a Robusta side of the cupping competition. But on the Robusta tables, people were also submitting, Liberica variety stuff. They were submitting, homemade Robusta crosses and things like that, that just you almost would never encounter, even in a traditional Robusta growing country, like in parts of Brazil or Uganda, etc. And I remember I was invited as the head judge for the Arabica portion, because I was a Q grader and CQI was running this event and I had volunteered before. And so they invited me to do this in the Philippines. And what I realized after the end of the first day was it didn't matter what I thought about any of this because the Philippines, as a country, as a producing country, they do produce a lot of coffee. They barely export any of it. It's consumed essentially by the producers in their own communities. Maybe it travels to a nearby city or something, and there's a rural urban divide in terms of production and consumption, but it's really all staying within the Philippines. And in addition to that, the country is a net importer of coffee. So they're buying coffee from, around the world, just like we might do in California. And what occurred to me was that if they love what they're doing and if they have an audience for it, then my opinion, even as a representative of CQI, is a little bit moot compared to the market success of what they're doing. And that's not to say that the coffees were unclean or, there was anything objectively problematic about them. They are Q graders themselves and they could have spotted that. But it's like if a coffee is particularly vegetal and flavor balanced, or it's particularly earthy, or has flavors that are, very, foreign to me, or things that I might downgrade if I was cupping coffees for Royal, for example, it's like, well, can I really tell the same people who produce the coffee and the people who are really excited to buy it, who know that, and they all know each other really well, can I really come in here with my standards, which I've been taught are objective and should be global, and have a bad opinion about what's going on? So it was like I encountered a local market that was resilient to any sort of criticism from the outside world. And it's like these are not the sweet, bright coffees that most specialty companies, obsess over. These were very different flavor profiles for me. A lot of them were like very earthy, very big bodied. Some of them, of course, were objectively beautiful according to CQI standard, but a lot of it was just like, the Filipino coffee producers were having a great time. They felt like they had sort of triumphed. They were showing their coffees off to the world. They loved what they had produced, and it's like, well, who am I to say that it's not great, that it's not successful? That one really opened my eyes. And of course, then it's like on our days off, we go to the local farmers market in a really nice neighborhood of Manila, and you have people making pour overs really carefully of like super dark roasted Liberica variety coffee. And it just, to me, tastes like dirt, but everybody's loving it. And you're eating durian fruit and you're drinking Liberica pour overs and the sun is out and everybody looks cool. And you're like, what's wrong with this? You know? So it sort of helped me understand the context and also how back to the institutionalization of cupping, I do think that people with the knowledge tend to be a little more paternalistic than they need to. And one thing that has really, affected me a lot as a coffee buyer now for about 10 years has been, entering other people's markets. You have to start with an attitude of respect and an attitude of learning. Because if you come in with your standards and you come in prescriptive, you're not going to learn nearly as much, and you might have a disrupting effect, and that might be negative, rather than going in and trying to glean something from what is valuable to producer communities of coffee, and then try and bring that back and argue on their behalf for consumers and help consumers understand how coffee might work differently in a particular place. Naturally, after my week in the Philippines, I came back and I was working for Blue Bottle at the time, and I desperately tried to convince other people at Blue Bottle to buy some of this coffee with me. And I was working on, it was literally like 7 or 8 bags of coffee that I just wanted to import to California. I really wanted to have a coffee to serve in like a handful of our cafes and talk about this competition and talk about the people who were producing it. And I couldn't win. I couldn't buy that coffee because I couldn't convince the other cuppers at the company who joined me in approvals to, understand the local standards of the Philippines. So I really lost that calibration, on the other side. But it definitely did open my eyes.
Yeah, I love that story because earlier, we were talking about what replaces correct. And context, it seems, might be a good answer in the sense that you might think about what their goals were for their own coffee versus what our goals are to imprint on other people's coffee. And I like what you said about, who am I to come in and say that this is wrong or this is good? If you come in prescriptive, you run the risk of disrupting something that, for all intents and purposes, should be perpetuated and celebrated. And that might be true also within your own cupping room in your roastery. If you come in prescriptive, you cut off your ability kind of to see what might be effective for your own business by instead replacing it with what you think the industry wants you to do versus what you should do.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, we can't all have the revelation of the Philippines, right? But we need to give ourselves permission to explore ways in which we can open up our senses to similar revelations, right? And, the title of this article that you wrote was really basically saying, like, hey, you don't have to worry. Isn't that great? Because there's a lot of worry going into a cupping about right and wrong, very narrow focuses on variables, but here's one that you don't have to worry about that might actually help you overcome that inertia of entering into a little bit more of an open-minded way of viewing cupping. What was the study that you found that you referenced in this article that validated those things that you had kind of thought were the case all along, but this kind of proved it?
It was an article that was published by a few different researchers who are affiliated with the University of California, Davis Coffee Center, which is a very new institution that was created slowly over the last maybe 8 or 10 years by a few of the leading chemical engineer professors at UC Davis, which at this point has become its own independent center for coffee research. It's become highly sponsored by, different companies within the coffee industry, people who really want to see research come out to do similar to what this particular paper did for me, which is to, validate gut instincts, to challenge the things that maybe, despite a lot of innovation in our understanding of coffee extraction or tracking green coffee or tracing our roast curves, things like that, we may still sort of reserve as being sacred. And I think cupping is very much one of those things. When I first, I was invited to do the column for Roast Magazine, and what I was interested in talking about was cupping and temperature. And as I was looking for research about that topic, I came across the equilibrium model paper that had been published by the Coffee Center. And at this point, I've participated in a few different sensory summits that's hosted by the UC Davis. I've been to like inaugural or sort of opening ceremonies for the Coffee Center. I'm close with some of the researchers. I love what they do. I follow the work that they publish, and I've seen them present some of their papers a few different times at the different events that UC Davis holds. It's an hour away from me. I love going out there, and a very good friend of mine who was previously the head roaster at Blue Bottle when I was the coffee buyer was a research assistant with them for a few years and is still working in international development doing an advanced degree. So she's, involved in that stuff too. So we, it's just a group of researchers that I have kept up with. And when I came across this article, I was like, okay, well, the first thing I have to do is learn the definition of adsorption because, it's one letter different from absorption with the B. And I was like, okay, well, is this really what I think it is? For me, it's a lot of definitional work and a lot of checking references and things. But the paper was great because the researchers did what only researchers could do. Like no individual coffee company that's just seeking to understand better what their cupping is giving them. And I've been in this position. It's part of my motivation for writing this article, where I'm trying to figure out vessel versus vessel or roast degree versus roast degree, controlling my own variables and trying to figure out how we should best cup our coffees. Because again, there's a lot of anxiety around cupping. Are we doing it correctly? Are we getting everything that we can possibly get from this? You don't want to miss, any note that might save your company in your purchasing decisions or something like that. So finding an article like this and seeing how the researchers not only subjected coffee to very very sort of industry standard cupping protocols, but they also used water temperatures of a really wide range. They ground coffee extremely coarse. They let coffee sit for over an hour in practically lukewarm water. They did it with decaf. I mean, they covered all of the variables. And basically, the conclusion of the paper was like a shoulder shrug, and it was like, nah, you know, if you let the coffee sit long enough, it kind of doesn't matter as long as you're in these very broad parameters. And that was hugely gratifying to me to find. And I had to figure out a way to sort of explain the article, but also make it a little argumentative, just because I enjoy that and it happens to be how I feel about it. But I wanted readers to, read my column and first understand the research, but then also start to think think for themselves about how cupping is actually quite a forgiving way of reading a coffee compared to filter extraction or espresso, um, and how we can all relax around it a little bit. And we can also start to think about cupping itself as a role in our decision making, and maybe it doesn't need to be at the center of our sensory decision making, if we are roaster retailers.
Interesting. So now the argument might be that because the variables are increased person to person with things like pour overs and other brew methods outside of cupping, I mean, if you're going to get a more full spectrum view of the coffee, that is, people, like cupping because it's so, controllable. So how would you seek to add different elements beyond cupping to make up for that lack of consistency? We're talking about earlier how we're not really getting the full picture, and it seems to be that if we're relaxing around cupping, then we should be, contracting around something else. So how do you add those things in to get that full spectrum while still achieving some consistency?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think the reason why cupping persists is because it's very efficient. And, if you're working in green purchasing or, quality feedback for producers to dial in a processing method, or, you're understanding how a coffee has aged, what the defect counts might look like, things like that. Um, if you are evaluating a green coffee, cupping is great because, you know, in front of you, very efficiently in little time, you can prepare multiple bowls or glasses of tiny amounts of coffee and you can compare them against each other. And it allows you to basically taste, for a single defective seed that might be in one particular cup versus the others. And it can give you a huge amount of information that way. The being that it was Roast Magazine and that I know a lot of the readers of Roast are roasters themselves, and most roasters are, they're making green selections, of course, but then what they're really spending a lot of their time on is product development, showing their coffees to wholesalers, brewing them in their own shops. That the brew method of cupping is very far removed from the way that coffees are served. And for most roasters, the coffees that they're putting over the counter really aren't going to resemble the cupping um, mostly at all. I think that it's for each individual person in these very sensitive positions to make the decision for themselves as to what is important, and it may be that you can run an entire business and you can, purchase green coffee for eternity without cupping a single bowl because it's just not what you need. I remember this was a few years before I started working at Intelligentsia, before um, they started cupping for everything. And Jeff, the coffee buyer at the time, described the early days where they would get, they would ask the local importer for samples from Guatemala, and they would get two coffees, and they would roast them up, grind them, and put them in their Mr. Coffee, and they wouldn't know anything about them, and they would just taste it, and they'd be like, "Ah, oh, awesome, that one," and they would just go from there. And of course, that's not at all how Intelligentsia works anymore. Um, but I think that you know, we do have a lot of tools and technology to really understand coffee extraction. And I don't think that most roasters or retailers necessarily need cupping as much as we think we do. And if you do, it should be because it's a preference and because it gives you the things that you need. Maybe you want to break a coffee down, 10 or 12 grams at a time, and you want to be able to have 3, 5, 8 glasses in front of you because that's how you need to make your decisions. But it may also be that like what you're really interested in is like understanding if a coffee is going to be forgiving in your batch brewer. So the way to make a decision about a coffee to purchase would actually be to extract it very exactly across a range of different extractions or strengths to understand the resilience of a coffee across, a range of different developments so that you can be confident that when you're giving it out to your wholesale accounts and they might be brewing it on a big variety of different machines that they're going to get something that they really love, and that your coffee is going to be successful and versatile, and have a broad appeal. I think that, cupping doesn't necessarily tell you that. But if what you're doing is, you have a relationship with a coffee producer and they want to know what you think of their new ginger, cascade hops, anaerobic geisha, and maybe you do want to break it down into 12 different glasses so you can help them understand whether or not it's consistent or whether or not, the flavors are clear enough, or because you know that they're cupping themselves, or they're interested in getting a Q grade from you or something. Like cupping can be a form of calibration between parties that don't necessarily work together. But I think the more intimate your team is, maybe the less you need to cup together. It becomes more of a preference than a necessity.
Okay, that makes sense. So you're keeping cupping, but there's layers to this whole thing.
That's right. I'm flattening the podium is what I'm doing.
Right. Yeah, there you go. So if we keep cupping around, being that, as is stated in this article, the window of temperature for cupping is wider than we thought, and the extraction achieves 21% pretty consistently. You just have to add time, and it kind of gets there. As long as there's not a lot of agitation introduced into it, that begs a question because I have, as I'm sure you have, cupped a lot of hot coffees,
Yes.
right? The crust break and the aromas from that is one of the best parts. It's really great. But now, in the light of this, it doesn't really seem that effective because obviously things change in the cupping bowl over time in what you're tasting. So what's the rhythm and timing that's the most ideal for this if we're going to maintain a cupping protocol? Like, what do we adopt and what do we evolve into?
That's a very broad question. I think it depends who the we is in the question because, again, every single person working in any type of value chain in specialty coffee is going to have a unique set of needs to themselves as an individual, and also preferences, and being comfortable with your preferences is also important. I often find myself saying when I'm having a conversation about calibration that calibration isn't making sure that you and your teammates are tasting exactly the same things. Calibration is understanding how you perceive things differently. Because when you understand the difference, then you're able to find common ground. And it often doesn't come down to making sure that everybody on a particular team throws out the same descriptors when they're tasting a coffee or the same, flavors necessarily. But if they're using, similar characteristics, and if the flavors are close enough, you can agree that you're calibrated. You might not ever have a single similar note as someone else, but if you understand how you taste differently, you can actually achieve quite a lot. So it's hard for me to be prescriptive when it comes to cupping protocol itself. I will say for me, over the years, I tend to definitely taste less, like fewer times per cupping on the cupping table than I used to. Um, like you said, we've all cupped a lot of hot coffee. We've all cupped in the evenings, when we should be having dinner and having some hydration and some nutrition. And instead, we're still at the cupping table, really trying to split hairs and make that final decision. I think the anxiety around cupping being this big impact point for roasting company finances puts a lot of pressure on, are you getting everything that you need out of a cupping? Because if you don't, you might make the wrong decision and your company might fail because you buy a coffee that nobody likes, that kind of thing. But I think if we understand what the limits are to cupping and what cupping can show us that other brew methods can't, then it, like we were saying before, it just becomes one of many options. I personally think that, heat does interfere with our perception. And I think at the beginning part of any cupping, you're going to have an incomplete extraction of the coffee in the cup, and you're going to have temperatures that are hot enough um, where they are covering up your ability to perceive flavor as well as you will later on. And so, in the article, I talk about our sort of communal preferences at Royal in our main cupping lab. And most people are just sort of hanging back off the table until 15 or 20 minutes. And then at that point, it's like conversation is over and we're cupping quietly. Everyone wants to hit their cups at the right time. And usually we're done by 30 minutes. And then, there are some people at the company who will make a single pass on the table. Um, and if that sounds like very little tasting to some people listening to this podcast, I would point out that in some cases we're tasting the exact same coffee that we've been purchasing for over 30 years. And so it's immediately familiar. And it takes very little analysis to approve of a shipment because we know what we're tasting. And there's a lot of trust there. There's a big context around cupping coffee that I think if you just talk about the preparation or the protocol, you're sort of missing all this other information that you bring to the table that allows you to be really efficient. A history with a particular coffee producer, like I just mentioned, is a huge one. Um, it would help us identify any sort of brewing defect or irregularity or something that we're not used to seeing, but it also helps us to make quick approvals if we know the coffee really well. Not everybody can travel to visit the people producing the coffees that they roast, but if you have the opportunity to do so, I'm sure you feel a lot more confident cupping their coffees forevermore because you've seen it with your own eyes and you understand, where the pulp pile is and um, what the fermentation tank looks like and where the dry mill is, and you've seen it every step of the way. So sometimes just looking at a green sample or just roasting it, you feel like you're 99% of the way there. Um, so, cupping doesn't just stand alone. None of us really walk up to a table having seen nothing or knowing nothing about the coffees that we're tasting. And if you are, you're probably not making $100,000 buying decision based on that. You're probably doing it at an event or, someone's trying to, market coffees to you and they want to know what you think, or they've blind coded it for you specifically. And that's an opportunity to have a really great conversation. But usually when there's a lot of financial decision making that's resting on a table, you're bringing a lot more information to the coffee. So in that sense, it's like, if you are using it for buying decisions, everything else about this particular coffee or what you need to accomplish comes with you to the table. And you should feel pretty confident that if your cupping is adequately prepared and um, you know what you need to know about the coffee, then you should be able to make your decision pretty quickly. The coffee is not necessarily going to surprise you or reveal something to completely change your mind. And that's what I liked about reading this research was that it just sort of pointed out that, over the amount of time that coffee sit on a table, you will have, there's a short arc to extraction and strength in the cup, but there's a longer arc to time and perceivability. And once you feel like you've adequately perceived what's there, then it's like the coffee's not really gonna, change all that dramatically. You're probably done, you know. And some of that confidence comes with time as well.
Okay, so there's diminishing returns after a certain point too, I imagine. It seems like somewhere in the middle of the coffee's heat arc, if you will, it's going to be hot, then lukewarm, then ice cold. Is there a point at which you say, look, we're not going to taste any more past this point because it's pointless?
Yeah, I think, that's personal. That point is definitely fatigue. Being sensitive to your own levels of fatigue um, can be really helpful to know when to walk away. I think that's, a lot of people ask me whether or not I think getting a Q grader certificate is helpful or if it's necessary. what with all the cupping resources that are available and opportunities for people to taste coffees, and Cup of Excellence competitions, et cetera. When I first was certified as a Q grader, there weren't a lot of opportunities, and it was really important to me to calibrate with that institution so that I had the language that I thought everybody needed. But not everybody feels that way. But my response is always that it's a great idea to do it because there are two things that you will get from going through this exercise. And the first is you will get to understand your own sense of fatigue when you can't think straight anymore, when you've been on your feet tasting coffee for too long and you know that you're just being ineffective. Like the rigors of the course will sort of reveal that to you about yourself. And the other one is, I don't think we've touched on this so far, is the importance of having references. I remember in my first Q grader course that I took at the beginning of 2014, I think it was, there was a person in my group who worked in quality control for M&M Mars, and they were buying mostly commercial coffees. And he had only worked in coffee at this one particular company in the same role, and he was really struggling to describe coffees that were delicious because he had no references for delicious coffees, because most of his job consisted of finding defects and counting them and accepting or rejecting coffees based on pretty minimal standards, physical characteristics, and basic cup cleanliness. And of course, I was sitting there, rattling off descriptors and being really effusive with my notes and being really passionate about the coffees that I loved and being, really sort of academic about the coffees that I didn't like as much. And at one point he turned to me and he was like, "Where did you learn to describe coffee like this?" And I wasn't expecting the question. And so I asked him what he meant. He was just like, "I didn't know there could be those flavors in coffee. How did you know there are those flavors?" It was just this very basic question. And it was so revealing to me about the importance of having references. Um, you know, and when you're cupping, the same coffee year after year, you of course have a very deep set of references or expectations, I should say, about what a coffee tastes like, what you're likely to find, and that can help you be really efficient at the table. And if you are cupping coffees you know nothing about, then your reference is pretty much every other coffee you've tasted. And as you're tasting, you're sort of digging into your sensory experience and you're making a match. You know, what does this remind me of? How does this particular, flavor category resemble other coffees that I know? How does this coffee stack up to, if you know the country of origin, other coffees from this country that you're familiar with? If you don't, maybe it's coffees of this particular processing style, or, if you know nothing at all, then it's every coffee in the world and you're just doing your best. But our references have a way of helping us sort of reduce clutter and focus, and they create a little bit of a constraint for us to work within, and that can be very helpful for making a decision on a cupping table. Working with your team, let's say you're in a roastery and you're on, quality control team, you're the buyer, you're the roaster, what have you, sitting down together, not in a cupping scenario, and actually drafting out the descriptors that are important in different cupping scenarios and agreeing on definitions for all of these, and then going to the cupping table and working on your acuity as a team. For example, do all of us here believe that this coffee has peaked citric acidity? That was a big one at Blue Bottle, which we at one point had to leave the cupping table, sit down, and define, because it was a big purchasing point for us. It was a make or break point for washed Ethiopia coffees, which were a huge part of our menu. And we needed them 12 months a year. We needed them in the blends, and we needed them to be of a very specific profile. And we realized that we were just sort of spinning our wheels because we didn't have anything defined operationally. So we could sit there and throw out, descriptors or flavors all day long, but if we didn't agree that the characteristics were correct, then it was really hard to make buying decisions. All these things contribute to, the constraints we make for ourselves at the cupping table. And, the really long answer here, of course, which I'm just trying to illustrate, is that there's no best way to do it. It's really, the best way is what you establish with your team is going to help you be the most effective at your own sensory decision making. And if you're out on your own and you're at a Cup of Excellence competition and your company's like, get us something great, then it's on you, and you have to come up with it for yourself. But it really helps to have operational definitions as a team while you are making decisions. And if you're, when we're roasting coffee at the Crown for service at Royal at our tasting room, um, we stopped SCA scoring all of our production roasts and we started a new reference style scoring where we're taking reference roasts and defining them characteristically, and then we're cupping against that for consistency's sake. And it's a little bit like matching, a pre-shipment sample to an arrival sample. If you're a coffee buyer, it's like at some point you're making a match. You've got a narrow set of descriptions and it's a binary. Yes, no. Is the coffee this? Is the coffee this? Is the coffee this? Excellent. It's the same coffee, And if it's the different coffee, well, you have to make an adjustment. Uh, but these things are all really important. It's very difficult to answer the question, what is the best way to cup for everybody? Because every team is different.
Sure. And the question that comes to my mind is obviously there's institutional wisdom at play with places like Blue Bottle and places that have been established for a long time. They've got history. And, smaller operations might have the same over the years. And their definitions of what they're going for is obviously going to be based on customer feedback, what they set out to do with their coffees in the first place, roast style, and all that stuff. But if you're just starting out, let's say you just started your roastery or you're a retailer that just started roasting your own, I guess it could be difficult to kind of decide what your reference is other than the wide world of coffee available to you out there on the internet. That'd be an interesting thing to get your opinion on, really, is as people set out to create consistency within new businesses, how might they best order their first steps?
That's another very big question. I think it is very daunting. And for me, over the years since I started as a barista, a lot of my coworkers and good friends have gone on to start their own businesses. And me, myself, I've always just kind of worked more and more in the supply chain as a buyer, now as an importer. And that was always my direction. But I've watched, friends that I know really well start their own businesses, and everybody kind of spins out at the beginning because I think if you simultaneously are, you've got a lead time until you maybe open your first location, you're kind of roasting in secret, you're iterating on stuff, you have limited cash flow, you need a little bit of green coffee, you have a roaster that is maybe not your ideal machine, but you're doing your best, you're bootstrapping, and it's like you've got to make all these decisions. And of course, every decision begets a number of different variables, right? Every time you roast a coffee differently, well, now you've set the limits on what all of your extraction range might taste like. You can iterate in different areas. You're just creating more and more variability as you go. And it can be really hard to get everything to coalesce into, I'll call it a vision or a direction for your program. But I think aside from, hopefully it's more fun than it is stressful, I think developing references by, frankly, bringing home other retail coffees that you love, putting them out on your own table with your own water, your own vessels, cupping everything next to each other, cupping the same coffee in a cupping scenario and doing a filter extraction, and starting to understand for yourself how coffee will translate from one method to another so that you yourself can start to make predictions about how things will act. I mean, as roasting companies grow up, they get really efficient about making decisions because their SOPs are tight and they have a lot of experience, roasting coffees the same way and brewing coffees the same way. It's very easy to translate in your mind, let's say from a purchasing decision at a cupping table, what that espresso is likely to taste like given the roasting parameters that are in place for this origin and the extraction parameters that are in place at the coffee bar. At the beginning, you're sort of thinking about all those things at once. And I think that, you can explore how a single coffee is going to change once it's roasted from the cupping table to call it a batch brew to espresso. And if you were to do that for, say, 2 or 3 small volumes of green coffee, you can start to build on this basic translation knowledge of coffee from one method to the next so that you get better at predicting And then as you get better at predicting, you can start to, make slightly bigger financial decisions based on your knowledge of that. I also think not doing this in a vacuum is hugely important. I think there are benefits to cupping in total silence or cupping alone. This is a big part of my job at Royal because part of my position is scouting for coffees. So I often will cup maybe 50 coffees at the same time, and it's just me in the lab alone. And my job is to screen, let's say, all 50 day lot samples from a single coffee farm um, down to like the top 10, and also deciding which ones I want to combine and which coffees I want to present to the other buyers at the company, along with my sales pitch for why we should be working with this coffee producer. I want them to show in the best possible way. I often have a step where I'm sort of curating and putting together coffees for my own business. And I do that totally alone because I want that space with a blank piece of paper to just sort of explore and figure things out. But when you're running a business, you really need to rely on your own systems. And I can't emphasize enough the benefit of sitting down and establishing targets or protocols for your own sensory decision making based on what's important to your business with your other decision makers and not at the cupping table. Because you don't want it to be just based on there's 5 coffees in front of you and everyone's arguing this or that. You really want to be able to, understand if a coffee matches an objective criteria. And if you have those established beforehand, then as you go step by step that you're staying true to, your values, you're staying true to your coffee program and how you want things to taste. I think in the beginning it's always crazy. As you get better at understanding how things translate, then you can start to map it out a bit and you can take bigger and bigger steps.
Yeah, that's great advice. And your customers end up reaping the benefits of your consistency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've all been in a scenario where customers disapprove of a change that you've made or a coffee you've bought or something. And keeping rapport with them as you grow is critical. One thing I used to say a lot at Blue Bottle, because the years when I was with that company, we grew substantially. And as we opened more and more cafes, we were in new neighborhoods with new customers, and we had new baristas who weren't quite as familiar with the origins of the company, or maybe hadn't worked in, one of the first 5 or 6 coffee bars, and we're sort of further and further from the center. But the quality of the coffee was the thing that was going to protect us as we grew. And I would say this to coffee producers, and I would say this to our roasters. I would say this to, baristas and trainings, and I would say this to our customers as well. It's like the thing that will allow us to grow and to challenge customers by bringing in, like a really light roasted natural and putting it on batch brew. And that's everybody's daily cup if you live within a square mile radius of this particular cafe location. Sorry guys, but we really believe in this coffee. If you can find a way to make that space with your customers and explain your decision making, and if you can defend the quality, then in my experience, and I've worked in really specific markets where Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York. These are certain customers, and they tend to look to roasters to tell them what's good. At least in the specialty market, I know that not everywhere in North America is that way. But I do think that, the better an understanding you have of your own criteria, your own objectives, and your own systems, the better equipped you are to sort of, surprise your customers a little bit or make a change and have people trust you, if you're able to talk about it with authority. That's been my experience, at least.
Yeah, again, great advice. And, this article talks a lot about the extraction yield in cuppings. I think what we've been discussing is a natural conversation that comes up as a result of kind of accepting that what we had previously kind of held ourselves to might in fact, it can change. And once we experience the freedom to be creative, we open up a lot of possibilities to really honor the variety of coffees we have at our disposal, especially these days. It's kind of an embarrassment of riches compared to earlier years in coffee. So this has really been a wonderful conversation, Charlie. And I would encourage everybody to read this article on Roast Magazine titled Why We Can Stop Worrying About Extraction Yield in Cuppings. And tell us a little bit about where we can learn more about you and stay in contact with your travels and work.
Well, I tend to be more or less invisible these days working at Royal because I am on the buying side, but I contribute a lot to the marketing that we put online. So royalcoffee.com is the website, and I'm regularly putting up blog posts with a huge range of topics, but mostly on the green coffee sourcing side. And I also am doing I'm frequently in promotional videos for the coffees that we're selling at the Crown, which is our tasting room, and small batch, very high end green coffee sales. So, I kind of pop up here and there like a little marketing mole, but for the most part, I'm really deeply involved in the logistics of building containers, working on microlot coffees, exploring new sources for Royal. So I'm kind of in a lot of the coffees, without being the person who necessarily talks about them. But the best place to see the work that I'm participating in is certainly Royal Coffee's website.
Awesome. Well, we're glad that you're doing that work. We're really grateful for you and really happy that you joined us on the show. Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I really loved the podcast. And if I could say, I don't know if this is awkward or not, but if I could dedicate this episode, I recently was in Chicago, and back in 2009, there was a barista who I was good friends with who worked at Metropolis Coffee, and she died on her bicycle in a very sad, tragic accident.
I remember this, yes.
Yeah, her name was Liza Whitaker, and she was a good friend. And I recently found myself, because it was the anniversary of the day that she was killed, just sort of checking up on some old Chicago barista friends on Instagram and stuff like that, and just thinking about those days. And it was a really happy time in my life, and it was a really exciting time for coffee in the city of Chicago, and Liza was a big part of that, and her spirit was at the center of a lot of what was happening. And so, I'm sure there are some people from those days who listen to your podcast, and I just would like to say hello to those people, and I hope that you're all happy and doing well, and I think of you. I've been thinking about you a lot these days, and I miss Liza.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. It was great to be on.
All right. Well, I hope that was freeing for you to listen to, and that you feel like, okay, now I can go from here and get creative and make some adjustments to the way that we cup our coffees, develop confidence through developing systems based on what your customers are really looking for. Set definitions based on what's working in the ecosystem of your roastery and your business. And as you do so, allow yourself to be creative with the ways that you incorporate maybe other methods to test a coffee's potential. And Charlie is very well spoken and gave us a lot to think about today. So a big thank you to Charlie Habegger of Royal Coffee. If you want to learn more about Royal Coffee, just go and visit royalcoffee.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Roast Magazine and read this article that Charlie has written, Why We Can Stop Worrying About Extraction Yield in Cuppings. You can find that over at roastmagazine.com. And with that is the end of today's show. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join me on another episode of Rate of Rise. Coming to the end of the year, and we've done so many great episodes on this series. I'm looking forward to continuing this in 2023, and I hope you have a good day. And of course, as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.